Hi, my name is Gil Mehrez. I'm working for the International Monetary Fund. I'm a senior economist there. And let me say up front, I don't work in Israel. And I wasn't involved in working in Israel for the last few years. So the view here are just mine, and don't hold the fund responsible for that. Saying that, the first thing I want to do is let me give you what I'm going to talk, but let me warn you that I'm going to be slightly spoiling the party. I'm going to spoil the party because the first thing I'm going to say is that the performance of the macroeconomic, in terms of macroeconomic of Israel, wasn't as good as everybody tends to say. It's true if you take consideration of the security and other challenges, one could say it was decent, but once you compare Israel to any other countries in terms of macroeconomic performance, and I'm not just talking about high inflation or large fiscal deficit, but also on economic growth, the performance is not so great. So that's the first thing I want to talk quickly. Then I'm going to say, talk about something which I view it as the cup which is half full. And the point I want to say is that Israel graduated in terms of its macroeconomic policy, both in terms of macro, both in terms of fiscal, both in terms of monetary exchange rate, and so on. So that's the second thing I want to say. And then the last thing I'm going to do is talk briefly about the challenges, and hopefully that 10 Israeli minutes would be enough to go over. So let me start with the performance of where Israel stands. So Israel right now stands, if you compare it to other OECD countries, it's somewhere at bottom half of the distribution of countries, standing somewhere close to Spain and Italy. Which is by itself is not a bad performance if you compare where Israel started. But it's somewhat misleading because we tend to think Israel started at a really terrible situation and then this looks good. But if you look at the growth rate, which is over the last 40, 50 years, the picture looks slightly different. So this shows you the growth rate of all the countries across the world. It's taken from a book by Barrow, and it talks about the growth rate from 1960 to 2000. And this is growth rate per capita. And you probably cannot read it, so I'll tell you Israel is standing over here. It's about 3% growth rate per capita between 1960 to 2000. And it's somewhat slightly at the upper side of the distribution, but it's not as good as Hong Kong or Korea, which grew at 6%. But of course, it's much better than if you look at Zambia, which actually had a negative growth rate for the last 40 years. So that by itself is medium, but the picture is a bit more complicated, and this is slightly misleading. It's misleading because of two reasons. One, it's because it ignores that the growth in Israel wasn't uniform. That is, in the 50s and 60s, Israel grew very fast, and in 70s and 80s, the growth really slowed down. And the other thing which it doesn't take into consideration is what we call in economics is convergence. That is, poor country tends to grow faster than rich countries. And the simple way to think about this is because you think about the story yesterday from Ms. Strauss, and the story is, there was no capital in Israel, then her mother went and bought a blender, and now you produced ice cream in Israel. So GDP almost doubled overnight because she just got a one blender machine. Now everybody has a blender, it's much harder to increase GDP per capita, or GDP in general, so countries seem to grow slower once they become rich. So let me show you here. Looks like I lost it. I think you lost it. Okay, so this is taken from a paper by Helpman. And what this does, it compares Israel in terms of growth rates, one across decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it also compares it to countries which were in a similar position in terms of GDP. That is, it would be unfair to compare a poor country to a rich country and say the poor country grow faster because they grow faster just because they are starting from a lower point of view. So this looks at countries which were in a similar position as Israel along those decades. So if you look at the 60s, Israel was doing pretty well in terms of more or less the middle of the distribution, somewhat higher, compared to countries with similar level of GDP per capita. The 50s, the 60s, Israel also did pretty well, even better than the middle, not as good as Korea, but pretty good on the top distribution. But in the 70s and the 80s, things turned to looks much worse. Israel now is somewhat at the middle, lower part of the distribution, and in the 80s, Israel is also pretty low in terms of the distribution. Similar picture you'll get. So the next slide will show you basically growth rate of GDP per capita in each decade. And the same picture as we saw before, except now I don't compare it to any other countries. So you look at 53 to 69, GDP per capita in Israel was very high, growing almost 6%. And that's what most of us, I think, remember, except I wasn't around then. And then you look from 70 to 80, and GDP per capita declined significantly. You go at like 2.5% during this decade, 80s even less than about 2%. Then the 90s, they somewhat increased, and then the 2000, of course, 2001, there's the big slowdown, which kind of caused the decade so far to be somewhat lower, but seems to be it's probably going to pick up, so we're probably in a somewhat better shape than we were earlier. And then that's just one last slide in terms of GDP per capita. If you compare Israel to various other countries from the 70s to 90s, so Israel is the blue, and you see Israel has been growing, but not really very fast, especially if you compare it to Ireland, which is the dotted line, which has this huge boom starting in the 90s, and this red line is the US. So if you compare Israel to other, I mean, this is just a random sample, but overall Israel during the 70s, 80s, 90s didn't do anything spectacular, or nothing that someone should be too excited about. Okay, so let me tell you now the good things in terms of Israel, what I see it now. So I think what's right now, I would say Israel in terms of macroeconomic has matured. Now, if you look at the policy, you look at all the macroeconomic, it's a mature economy that's ready to keep on and start to grow faster, and maybe like Ireland. So one thing quickly is in terms of the structure of the economy. You look at the structure of the economy, and as I said earlier, Israel moved from being a traditional low-skill manufacturing and agriculture to a much more high-tech economy. And if you compare it to the US in terms of the structure of the economy, it's pretty similar to the US, although the US is not by the best example, but just show you the business sector in Israel and the US is somewhat similar, slightly smaller in Israel than the US, and the public sector in Israel is about 19% of GDP compared to 11% of GDP, so somewhat slightly higher in Israel, but the differences are not so large anymore. And if you compare Israel to average OECD, because the US is somewhat on one side, Israel is really comparable to most OECD countries. So in this sense, structure of the economy, Israel is very mature. You look at fiscal policy, then fiscal policy has been struggling probably until the last decade with very high deficits, so that's kind of deficit of 10 to 15%. Then the stabilization and the fiscal policy in terms of deficit started to decline, was doing pretty good until 2000, getting into pretty low level, and then the Intifada and the high-tech burst, so the deficit increased, but right now the deficit is starting to go back now to normal, and I think from now on it probably would stay at a normal level. Could be disagreement whether 1 or 2, but overall fiscal policy is in a, what I would call international standards and mature or graduated. Okay, now let me go quickly in terms of government expenditure. Israel, as I said earlier, was a very socialist country in the beginning, and government expenditure as a share of GDP were somewhere at 60–70% of GDP. Over the years, they declined, and right now we stand at about 45% of GDP. If you compare it to OECD, Israel still has somewhat a larger public sector than the OECD country, or government spending than OECD, and larger than the US, as the US is somewhat on the lower part of government spending. This is slightly misleading. The reason why it's misleading is because Israel has large expenditure on defense and interest rate. Once you exclude those two, you see that actually Israel, in terms of public sector, in terms of government expenditures, are actually not so large compared to OECD. So if you look at the next slide, let's compare Israel to OECD, but excluding defense expenditure and interest rate expenditure. And therefore, you see that Israel is actually somewhat below the OECD averages. So in terms of government sector, one could say Israel is really, as I said earlier, some of matured or graduated to levels which are similar to international, and now, like a mature person, need to decide where you go from here. But at least you graduated, and now you can deal with issues more substance rather than just trying to reach to maturity.